The Tallarico Group has helped CEOs grow their sales and grow their leaders for over a decade. Now, founder and president Bill Tallarico brings you Total Growth, a podcast that explores the challenges of selling, leading, and building great relationships.
Welcome back to the Total Growth Podcast. Today I'm joining you again with Matt Rogers, my partner here at the Tallarico Group. Matt, thanks for finding some time for us this afternoon.
Absolutely.
Hey, good to be with you. Matt and I are going to be talking a little bit today about proposal draft reviews. Proposal draft reviews are something we've always enforced, if you will, inside of our client base because of the power that they bring in increasing closing percentages and helping us maintain control of the sales process through the end, right? And so many times, Matt, we find our clients, they tend to surrender some of that control they have of the sales process when we get to proposal time, right? You know, you work so hard through discovery and you work so hard to identify some good mutual solutions with the client. And then we get the proposal and we're like, yeah, great. Send me a proposal. And what do most salespeople do?
Send the proposal.
That's right. And what happens when you send the proposal?
You lose control, you lose urgency, and you really don't know what happens next. And I think proposal draft reviews, if we look from the frame of mind of what are most salespeople trying to do, and I think unfortunately there's a lot of salespeople out there that think it's their job to propose. And their process works up and it stops at the proposal phase. And like we always joke, sales is not a participation sport.
That's right.
Right? We're in sales to win, right? Mm-hmm. And just getting to proposal phase isn't good enough. There's not going to be any participation trophies there. And I think this is especially relevant now. As you mentioned before, it's always important, but tying in what we talked about last time about that task clarity. So we're in an environment, remote environment. There's a lot of salespeople that don't necessarily have that task clarity. What should I be doing now, right? If you don't have task clarity, anything looks good. Now you throw a proposal on top of that. Maybe they haven't been talking to as many people. Wow, people are excited. They have happy ears. And ultimately, we're adding a step and to increase win rates, to increase urgency, to increase living in discovery. So we're slowing it down to ultimately speed it up. And what we're seeing right now, that when that proposal, there's an opportunity for that, people are speeding up, but ultimately they're going to slow down. And
when you say adding a step, Matt, that's that proposal draft review because, you know, salespeople who, I hate calling them weak, but let's call them inexperienced. When they hear, send me a proposal, they get very excited, right? That's the happy ears kicking in. They're like, hey, somebody likes me. And they get excited. They toss that proposal through the email and, you know, makes its way through space, lands on somebody's desk. Somebody opens up the proposal and we all know the drill. The first thing they look for is price, right? So we've spent an entire sales cycle, whether it's been 1 call, 2 calls, 8 calls, 10 calls, getting to a point of selling value only to surrender all the value we've established to somebody tossing the proposal to the pricing page, right? And they shuffle back, they find the price, and like, way more than I was expecting it to be, which, number one, that's a problem, by the way, if they're surprised by the price when the proposal shows up. But they forget about all the value that we've built, and they forget about why the scope of work is what it is. And you talked about slowing down. And we oftentimes talk about slowing down to speeding up or having that patience that allows us to accelerate sales cycles, not going at the pace of the client, but trying to dictate that pace. And when we introduce this new step of the proposal draft review, or the PDR, as you like to call them, that PDR makes us pause, say to somebody, hey, I know we're going to have questions when I send this over. Can we find 20 or 30 minutes on the calendar next week to review this together? You get to go through those steps and reinforce what the statement of work was, right? You mentioned that this was important. You mentioned your solution had to look like this. You mentioned that your team needed blah. And we're constantly reinforcing why it's us, why it's that statement of work, which ultimately is going to justify the price, right? The investment that they need to make. So it's an unusual concept to slow down, to go fast in the sales process. And that's exactly what PDRs allow us to do, because once you get through the PDR, we're home free usually, right? You know, we're able to ask somebody, how's that look? And when somebody pushes back on price, we can start to ask them, well, what do you want to pull out of the scope? We don't have that opportunity to have that advanced discussion with them or that educated discussion with them if we're just submitting proposals, because they're making their own determination. And usually that's when our clients are calling us saying, how do I get somebody to re-engage? It was going great. I submitted a proposal. I haven't heard from them. They've gone black.
Mm-hmm. There are so many benefits of doing a proposal draft review. And you mentioned the benefit of being able to diffuse a bomb, right? Mm-hmm. If they have a question, a concern, they're thinking about an aspect of the proposal a certain way, I want to be there in front of them to assist. Mm-hmm. Not assume that they're going to get to the solution or the outcome that we want, right? Because buyers are always following a process, mm-hmm. right? Either their process or our process. And if they're following their process, it isn't built to benefit us. So being in person or over Zoom or Skype or whatever it may be in this environment, mm-hmm. we get to do fuse bombs. We get to negotiate. Oh, by the way, we've all probably made a mistake or misunderstood something on a proposal. We get that opportunity to talk through things. And stepping back to how we position this, it's very important that we show the mutual benefit of doing it. Mm-hmm. That this isn't, if you're an in-person salesperson, I'm going to be in the area, let me drop off the proposal. It isn't, hey, I'm going to shoot you the proposal, let's chat, maybe. We found it to be very mutually beneficial that we sit down together or we look at each other through the computer to go through it, to answer any questions. I'm sure some may come up, and to ensure that we have the best solution for you. And then I've heard everything correctly. And there's so much power in that. And one thing I do want to mention is that big believer in agenda setting. And I think agenda setting is extremely critical in proposal draft reviews, especially when they're new. Because oftentimes salespeople use the proposal as their crutch. So we get to a proposal draft review and we start leafing through and we're talking about every word on the page and we're talking about us and all the benefits of what we can provide. Where there's nothing more powerful than setting the agenda up front. Bill, can't wait to discuss the proposal with you. Love to learn a little bit more about your current situation. I'm sure you're going to learn a little bit more about us. Mm-hmm. Hey, before we jump into it, most importantly, what did you want to achieve today? Mm-hmm. Talk about jumping right into discovery. And oh, by the way, what the client has to say is always going to be far more important than what we have to say.
That's right. And when you set that agenda and you ask what they're hoping to accomplish today, especially before we get into the proposal, that's when we hear things that are irrelevant. And they might say, hey, I know we talked about these things, but things have changed for us, right? I know that you built a proposal based on what we talked about 3 weeks ago. Things are different now. We need to adjust. Okay, that's fine. And I want to know that up front rather than spend 30 minutes going through something that's not relevant to them, right? Number one. And then number two, when we can go through that proposal step by step, saying, you mentioned this, here's how that we would address that issue. Does that still feel right? And they go, yeah, 3 times a week, or, is when we need service, or, yeah, we have 55 users, like we said in our discovery meeting. Okay, great. Making sure that hasn't changed. When we go through, we find people point out things that might be misunderstood. And in many cases, even if we're just regurgitating to them what they shared with us in our earlier sales calls and our earlier discovery meetings, it's still great to make sure it's still valid, right, today. That also allows them to give us some feedback before we get to the price of scope we may need to adjust. And what we've found in virtually every industry and every client we work with is those conversations around the PDR, around that review, actually lead to greater mutual building of the scope. And clients are more inclined to be at a natural yes at the end. We're out of the selling phase. We're more into building phase. We're building the solution versus trying to tell them or sell them on something that we want to push. And, that's something we never believe in. We always believe sales is something we do for somebody, not to somebody. Something you may grow tired of hearing on this podcast, but we talk about that continuously. It's a great way to share that information with people to get mutually aligned before we get into the price being an issue.
If we work really hard up front closing happens naturally. And let's face it, we would all love if we were in sales cycles where we're the only one talking to them. But oftentimes, whether it's price checking, an RFP, depending on your industry, this is not done in a vacuum. So we have the opportunity to hear questions, concerns, maybe they further analyze their thought or talk to their board or decision making, and things have changed and they've reevaluated things since we've last been there. So it's a great opportunity, since it's not done in a vacuum, to see what's changed. And getting back to agenda setting, I often follow it up, what would you like to accomplish today, with the second question: what's changed since the last time we have been together? I think that's really important. We have to have the confidence to have that 1-2 punch. And Bill, talk about the importance of proposal draft reviews. Again, much like we'd love it to be in a vacuum, decision maker wise, we can't always necessarily get in front of the decision maker. Right. So how can we utilize a proposal draft review to help coach or navigate the process when that decision maker is not there, or we're only speaking with one of the many decision making?
Sure. So, when we get to the end of that review, it's imperative upon us to identify the path. And when we ask people about what happens next, we always like to ask what happens next and get some feedback. So let's just pretend here for role-playing purposes, we're at the end of the proposal draft review. Let's just pretend that we say to somebody, hey, how do you feel? Tell me the one reason you might say no. What would be the one reason you wouldn't work with us based on what we've gone through today? That one thing question is very powerful versus an anything question. Oftentimes, Matt, we see people that get real brave and they go, hey, is there any reason you wouldn't work with us now? You haven't given somebody permission to tell the truth at that point, right? We want to ask a one thing question and say, hey, Matt, based on this review, what would be the one reason you wouldn't work with us moving forward? And you're going to tell me the truth. It might be, well, my brother-in-law is in the business, and I don't know, if I go with you, what's Thanksgiving going to look like? How am I going to be with him on vacation this year? Whatever it might be, they can tell us about the incumbent. They can tell us about someone else they know. They might tell us about fears they have with budget. It might be, well, I feel good about it, but, Larry, the CFO, he's not going to feel good about it. Okay, tell me about Larry. What's Larry look for when you bring things like this to him? What are the questions he typically has? Or they might tell us the process. That's what we have to say. Walk us through that process. And walk us through the process becomes very powerful, not for us to gain information, but oftentimes to help coach them on what happens next. Because we forget sometimes that the people we're selling to aren't necessarily buying something every day, right? They're not buying what we're selling on a regular basis. So sometimes they're learning how they're going to buy this, right? And they start thinking and go, well, boy, I don't know. I guess I have to get Sally involved. Or tell me about them. What do you think their questions are going to be? What's going to be the one concern Sally has? So that opens up a lot of power for us at the end to get to a clear understanding of what happens next, and allows us to set a clear next step. Clear next steps means that it's going to appear on somebody's calendar. A next step is follow up in 2 weeks. Clear next steps are we get the calendar invite out, and we're going to talk with you 2 Thursdays from now at 10 o'clock. And the agenda is going to be this. So those are the things that generate or come out of, I think, the proposal draft reviews. If it's not a natural close, right? Many times if we are with the decision maker, they're ready to say yes at that point. If it's not the decision maker, we're able to identify who we need to get involved, what's going to be the hurdles, and how we're going to address them. Because we have our people thinking through how they're going to be selling this internally and how they manage that process.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes salespeople, if it isn't a natural close and there's a next step in the process, whether they're going out for other bids and they're waiting for those bids, whether they have to review as a team or they're going to present to a board, we have to be brave in that moment, and we have to continue to fight for that clear next step. And it's very possible. If someone says to me, hey, great, but we have to wait for a couple bids. Awesome. How long is that going to take? Mm-hmm.
And what are you hoping to learn from those other bids that have failed to help you understand today? right? And if they say, well, it's just part of the process. We need to get 3 bids. Why? And there are clients, there are customers that are in the public space or, large enough that, they have corporate bylaws or whatever it might be that require 3 bids over a certain amount. We get that. But we want to make sure that they understand what's happening in the process and unlevel the playing field. We worked with one client a couple of years ago, and they were part of an RFP process on virtually every deal they had, right? Continuous RFPs. And one thing we helped them understand was how to enter RFP discussions or interviews where instead of just going through their proposal line by line, section by section, and trying to identify where they were better than everybody else or, toot their own horn throughout the process. One of the things we helped them understand was going into the process and saying, hey, great RFP. Everything you asked for is in there. Rather than go through it today line by line, I'd rather bring up to you the 3 things that we felt were missing. There were 3 things we were surprised that weren't in the RFP that we'd like to address. It helped them tremendously with their closing percentages, right? Because it demonstrates some expertise. In a position of authority, when you go into an environment like that and demonstrate to somebody, you become a consultant, right? You give them that versus a vendor. And with that, you end up having, again, increased closing percentages and much more effectiveness. But I think, to underscore again, if you're in an environment today where you're proposing to clients, and virtually all of us are, right, introduce proposal draft reviews into your process. Don't submit proposals, review proposals. And I think you'll find your closing percentage go through the roof. And in today's environment, when everybody is more likely to meet via Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever it might be, it's an easy thing to do because it allows you to also control the page turning, right? So when we meet with somebody via Zoom and we go through that process of reviewing the proposal, it's easy for us to share our screen and go through 1 page at a time with them to help control the flow, control the momentum, and control that pace.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great point. And let's talk a little bit about some of the best practices that we have. And one that you brought up, and it's unique, I believe, and it takes people aback whenever we introduce it. But we're really big fans of not giving them the proposal prior to the meeting. Now, I understand those of you out there that have a lot of complexities, and that might not be the case, but I would say for 90% of the people that we coach, it's okay for them not to get the proposal prior to. And the goodness there, as we talk about the bill, and you can jump back into it, the 73855, we get to see their body language. We get to hear the tone of their voice and how they ask a question. So there's immense goodness in them seeing the price for the first time, them clarifying the scope, them seeing some of the features and benefits that come out throughout the conversation.
Absolutely. And when you refer to the 73855, there was a study done at Harvard a few years back that said there's 3 components to the impact of our communication. The first is words, the second is tone, the third is body language. And only 7% of the impact of our communication comes from our words. 38% is in the tone, 55% is in our body language, which is why when we're having these proposal draft reviews, and I would argue any customer or client meeting via a web share application like Zoom or WebEx, turn your camera on, right? And encourage them to turn theirs on. I mean, you don't want to say, hey, before I share the numbers with you, I need you to turn your camera on. But if you turn on your camera, more people are likely to follow, right? And there's also been a more recent study done, I think it was by Gong, right, that said there's a 42% increased closing rate when salespeople turn on their cameras on Zoom than if they don't. So make sure we're engaging these clients that need us so desperately in these days, engaging them with our cameras on. Let's make sure that we're slowing down a little bit so that we can speed up. And we introduce the step of the proposal draft review. A very easy way to do it is to say, hey, Matt, I'm getting this together. I'll be happy to get that proposal together for you. I'm sure you're going to have some questions of me, and I know I'm going to have some questions of you, because it always happens, right? So it's very authentic and very honest. Can we schedule 30 minutes together next week to go through this together? People are very open to that. I mean, the cases of people pushing back and saying, well, no, send it over to me and then we can talk, they're rare. And I think when they happen, you also have somebody who's probably not ready to buy. And that's something we want to know at that point also. Those people that push back and are like, no, I want to see it first. Then I'll let you know if we could schedule some time. That tells us we might not be where we thought we were in that sales cycle. But I think if we can introduce that step, we've seen great data on increased closing percentages, maintaining pricing, so you don't have to give up discounts, which means we're not giving up margin, and building healthy relationships where people see us more as a consultant. So good luck out there, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast on proposal draft reviews. If you have any questions, please visit our website, telericogroup.com, and let us know if we can help you in any way. Good luck, stay safe, and God bless.